A single mom shielded a baby girl from gunfire, not knowing she was the daughter of a Mafia boss. For 6 long months, I had traced the faintest of trails through hundreds of financial statements, each more obscure than the last, until they finally led me to a single text message from an unfamiliar number, glowing on my phone screen at 9:30 on a Tuesday night. The message was brief, almost cryptic. Jordan's, 10 o'clock. Bring nothing. Come alone. Want proof, don't you? I stared at the words, my reflection dim and distorted in the windowpane of the 6th-floor motel room in an aging apartment block on the southern edge of Denver. I was 42, a single mother, working as an investigative reporter for the Denver Herald with a schedule that devoured nearly 70 hours each week. I had waded into every kind of scandal, from political corruption to money laundering to the dark reaches of war crimes, but never had I stepped toward something so vague, so reckless, so close to madness. On my feet were scuffed flats, my temples streaked with silver from too many sleepless nights, and a heart still learning how to beat after being abandoned by the man I once called my husband. She is 14 now, and I have buried myself in work, as if stopping for even a breath might cause everything to fall apart. This was not the kind of message a woman with a teenage child should respond to. And yet I had read every forged tax return, every wire transfer through shell companies, every redacted contract, each pointing to something that didn't add up. Every time I reached for the truth, it slipped away like smoke. This time, I couldn't stay away. At 9:45, I stood in front of Jordan's Steakhouse, a place so upscale it made me feel like a ghost in my faded wool coat and shadowed eyes. The scent of seared meat and wine drifted from the opening and closing doors, turning my stomach with nerves. I carried no recorder, no notebook, no phone. I had even taken off my watch. I brought only myself. Just as I was about to step inside, a piercing scream cut through the air from behind the restaurant. Then gunshots. One, then another. People began spilling out in panic. I barely had time to turn before I saw her. A little girl in a yellow dress, frozen under the streetlight, eyes wide with fear, paralyzed. A woman across the street screamed her name, but it was too late. A pickup truck came barreling forward, its window cracked open, a gun protruding. I didn't think. I threw myself toward her, wrapped my arms around her tiny shaking body, and shoved us both to the ground, shielding her as bullets tore through the air, close enough to hear their hiss. Glass shattered. Tires screeched. The truck fled. I felt warm blood spreading across my shoulder. The girl was sobbing, clutching my shirt with desperate hands. Then someone pulled me up. A strong arm, a man in a white dress shirt, eyes locked on mine with a look that was part gratitude, part disbelief. He didn't speak. He looked down at the child, then back at me. In that moment, I knew I had stepped into something far greater than I could have imagined, and possibly more dangerous than any story I had ever chased. That night, I thought I was searching for the truth, but I had no idea the little girl I had just saved was the only daughter of a Mafia kingpin. And from that moment on, there was no way back. Before we go any further, if something in this story has quietly touched your heart, take a moment to subscribe, like, and share the YouTube channel Dear Single Mom, so you won't miss the heartfelt, inspiring stories told with honesty and care. We'd love to know where you're listening from. Leave a comment below and share your location, so we can see how far this story is reaching, whose hearts it's finding across America and beyond. Thank you for being here. Now, let's step with me a little deeper into the secrets I perhaps was never meant to uncover. I woke up in an unfamiliar room, a soft white light glinting off a glass-paneled ceiling above me. There was a faint scent of antiseptic in the air and the steady, rhythmic beep of a heart monitor, enough to tell me I was in a hospital, though not any public hospital I had ever known. The walls were painted a warm cream, the sheets were crisp, and carried the faint trace of essential oils, and somewhere down the hallway, the notes of a piano drifted like morning fog. A dull ache throbbed in my shoulder. I couldn't lift my left arm. The door opened and a petite Asian nurse stepped inside, followed by the tall man with the heavy eyes who had pulled me off the street the night before. He was neatly dressed in a pale blue shirt and gray trousers, a sleek watch on his wrist that whispered wealth without shouting. He didn't speak right away. He just looked at me, as if weighing something in the silence. Then he placed one hand gently on the edge of the bed, leaned forward slightly, and spoke, his voice rough and slow, like every word had been measured in advance. "I'm Daniel Reyes. I'm the father of the little girl you saved. I don't know how to thank you." I held his gaze without flinching. Those eyes weren't quite those of a grateful father or a man overcome with emotion. There was something colder behind them, something dangerous, like ice beneath still water. I asked quietly, "Is she all right?" He nodded. Sophie's okay. Just a few scrapes on her leg. You saved her life. I closed my eyes again. The pickup truck, the bullets ripping through the night air, that tiny hand clinging to my coat. It all rushed back with vivid clarity. I asked him why someone would open fire like that. He sat down in the chair beside the bed, leaning forward just slightly, as if ready to reveal a fraction of the truth while keeping the heart of it hidden. I've made enemies in business, he said. Not everyone's happy when I refuse to play along. It could have been a warning. Or it could have been an attempt to kill. The police are looking into it. I asked him why he had summoned me to that place. He paused. His eyes stayed on mine. Then he said, "It wasn't me. I didn't send that message." I let out a long breath, the chill of it spreading through my chest. Then who did? Someone wanted me there. Someone who knew I was investigating shell companies and wanted me to see something, or not survive it. Daniel said nothing else. He stood up and told me I should rest, but just before he walked out, he said something I would never forget. "I've hired a private doctor to watch over you. You're safe here. But if you want to leave, it has to be through me. There are too many things you don't yet understand." I didn't know why, but I believed him. Maybe it was the way his voice didn't waver when he spoke of his daughter. Maybe it was the strange calm he held in the middle of so much chaos. But I knew one thing for certain. I was no longer an outsider. Last night, I witnessed an attempted murder. I had brushed against a world I'd only ever seen through classified files and sealed court documents. And worse, I had just saved the daughter of the very man whose name had sat at the top of my suspect list for 6 straight months. Sophie, the little girl in the yellow dress, was sleeping in the next room. I glanced through the glass and saw her curled around a stuffed bear, her eyes closed but with the traces of dried tears still on her cheeks. No one is born to live under the shadow of violence, but she had grown up wrapped in the invisible armor of a father whom the city whispered about as the kingpin of a dark logistics empire. I was a stranger here, a single mother with a pen and a deadline, chasing the truth because it's the only thing that's ever made sense. But now I owed a life, and Sophie's eyes were burned into my heart like a scar. I knew one thing, and I knew it deep in my bones. The truth behind all of this would no longer live in spreadsheets or legal memos. It was here, breathing, dangerous, and far too close. 3 days later, I was moved to a large house nearly an hour west of downtown Denver, tucked quietly between towering pine trees and hills dusted with the last clinging traces of snow. No one told me exactly why I was being brought here, only that the hospital was no longer safe and Daniel had arranged for a private place where I could continue to recover. The car passed through a set of massive iron gates and followed a long stone-paved drive that led to a sprawling European-style estate. The grounds were enclosed by high fences and cameras watched from every corner. But what unsettled me most wasn't the scale of the place or its eerie silence. It was the anonymity. There was no name, no address. It didn't appear on satellite maps. A house without a past. A place built to be known only by its owner. The housekeeper led me to a room on the 2nd floor. He was an older man, but he moved with the quiet, straight-backed posture of someone with military training. The room was modest in size but immaculate, every detail carefully chosen. On the desk was a brand-new laptop, several neatly stacked folders, and a short handwritten note. I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was Daniel's. "Miss Morgan, I know you don't trust me. Maybe you never will. But I need you alive. At least until I can make this right. This laptop has a secure login that only you can access. Inside, you'll find everything you need to understand what you're really up against. It's taken me 7 years to gather this. Someone has been using my name to hide his operation. And he's not stopping. He'll kill anyone who gets close to the truth." I set the letter down, my fingers trembling. I couldn't tell if it was from fear or the feeling that I was slipping deeper into something I could no longer walk away from. I powered on the laptop. A single folder appeared on the screen, titled Blackline. Inside were hundreds of files, payroll records, accounting spreadsheets, satellite photos, asset reports, and leaked email threads. All of them connected to a shipping network under the Reyes Logistics banner, but with patterns I knew too well. Shell company structures, circular transactions, and particularly large charitable donations to nonprofit organizations operating in the Eastern Corridor. The same corridor where human trafficking and covert money laundering operations had surfaced in one of my investigations 3 years ago. I scrolled until I stopped on a blurry but unmistakable image from a security camera. A man standing beside a cargo container. His face was half lit, but I knew it instantly. Richard Callahan, former congressman. A man long rumored to have ties to an Irish crime syndicate in the Northeast, though no charges had ever stuck. I had written a full exposé on him. faced threats, lawsuits, and in the end, the paper pulled the story to protect its name. That case had shattered what faith I still had in justice. Now, here he was again, buried in the very files Daniel had called proof. Something in my chest tightened. This was no longer a case of laundering or fraud. This was a powerful, brutal network rising again under the camouflage of a clean corporate shell, and Daniel, whatever he had been before, was now standing at its center. I left the room and wandered the long hallway until I reached the living room. No one was there. Only the soft golden light of recessed ceiling lamps and the faint notes of classical music playing from hidden speakers. I found Sophie curled on the sofa, hugging her stuffed bear, her eyes fixed on the flickering screen of a cartoon but not truly watching. I sat beside her. She turned toward me and asked softly, "Does it hurt?" I nodded. "And you?" She shook her head. Then, after a quiet moment, she said, "My mom died when I was 3. My dad says I look just like her." I looked into her eyes, clear and still, but already hardened by things a child should never have to know. A part of me cracked open. I placed a hand gently on her back and rubbed it in slow circles. "I'm scared," Sophie whispered. "So am I answered truthfully. I didn't know what was happening, who to believe, or how deep this web went. But I knew this. There was a child being dragged into a world she never should have touched, and I had become the only person standing between her and the dark. In a house with no name, no address, and no past, I realized I was living through the most dangerous days of my life. But perhaps they were also the most honest, because for the first time in years, I wasn't just writing about the truth. I was living inside it, and it wasn't clean. It was filthy, but I couldn't turn back. I couldn't sleep that night. The pale glow of the laptop screen cast long shadows on the ceiling, like a silent ghost reminding me that what I was looking at wasn't just data. It was a web of secrets buried deep within the layers of power that ruled this society. The names inside the blackline folder weren't strangers. They were people I had investigated, interviewed, suspected, but never had enough to expose. Richard Callahan was only the tip of the iceberg. Beneath him was a chain of individuals entrenched in finance, real estate, even local government, all connected to shell companies used to launder money, siphon public funds, and bankroll operations so hidden that the press could never reach them. I remembered those long nights spent alone in the newsroom, the yellow light on the wall as I scrolled through endless anonymous bank transactions. Back then, I used to call those numbers ghosts, because they would appear, then vanish without a trace, as if some invisible force was erasing them the moment I turned away. Now I knew. That ghost had a name, and its name was Callahan. I went back through my old articles, opened up drafts marked with red edits, entire paragraphs struck through because there wasn't enough proof or because the paper had been pressured by powerful donors to drop the story. One piece in particular had never seen the light of day, but I had kept it, tucked away on a private drive. It was about a fire at a warehouse on the west side of Denver 3 years ago. Authorities claimed it held smuggled goods from Europe, but all they found was ash. At the time, I'd received an anonymous tip suggesting that the warehouse wasn't just for merchandise, it was a transit point for undocumented immigrants, including women and children. I followed that lead until the editor-in-chief pulled me aside and told me to let it go, said I should be careful, that I was brushing up against something far bigger than I realized. Now, in Daniel's files, I found a satellite photo of that very warehouse, but this time, it was military-grade imagery, showing trucks coming and going at hours that didn't match official reports. There were shipment manifests, driver names. One of them appeared on the employee list of Reyes Logistics. I didn't know if Daniel had given me this to prove he was innocent, or to pull me in so deep that I'd never be able to climb out. Whatever his reason, it worked. The more I read, the more those scattered threads I'd chased for years began to weave together. A map formed in my mind, a network designed so that no one could ever see the whole of it. Daniel was part of that, either a victim or a partner. I stepped out of the room just before dawn, walking the long hallway that led to the back terrace. A fine snow was falling, thin as mist, leaving a pale layer over the stone path. Daniel was already out there, holding a cup of coffee, his eyes fixed on the woods in the distance. I didn't have to ask if he knew I would come. He simply tilted his head in greeting and motioned to the chair beside him. I sat down. We were quiet for a long while. Then I asked, directly, "Why give all of this to me?" He didn't answer right away. He sipped his coffee, then looked at me, and for the first time, the coldness in his gaze had softened. "Because you see what others overlook. Because you don't owe me anything. Because you saved my daughter." I nodded, not in agreement, but because I understood. This story now belonged to me. No one else could tell it. No one else would dare. And the ghosts I had once named in buried drafts, those shadows I thought had slipped away, were back, clearer than ever. But this time, I wouldn't let them vanish. Not again. Dinner was served at 7, just as the housekeeper had said. I stepped into the dining room as the crystal chandelier cast warm golden streaks across the dark wood floor. The room was larger than I expected, the table long enough to seat 10, though only 3 places had been set, one at the head, one to the left, and one to the right. Daniel was already there, dressed in a crisp white shirt with the sleeves neatly rolled, his tie loosened. Beside him sat Sophie in a cream silk dress, her hair tied back, her eyes as quiet and watchful as they had been the first time I saw her. She gave me a small smile when I entered. I nodded, trying to return it, though my chest still carried the weight of everything I'd uncovered just hours earlier. It felt like stepping into a family dinner hosted by a man the entire city whispered about as the architect of a shadow empire. And I was the guest who couldn't say no. Daniel pulled out the chair for me. The first course was sweet corn bisque with toasted garlic bread. I forced myself to maintain some semblance of politeness, though my mind was still spinning with images and data from the files I had been buried in all afternoon. The beginning of the meal passed in near silence, broken only by the gentle clinking of spoons against porcelain. It was Sophie who spoke first. "What do you do, Miss Rachel?" I glanced toward Daniel, who offered nothing more than a quiet smile, as though he too was waiting for the answer. "I'm a journalist," I said. "An investigative reporter, to be specific. I like uncovering things that people would rather keep hidden." She nodded with interest. "Like a detective in the movies?" "Something like that," I replied, though the words felt more like fiction than ever before. But then Daniel spoke. "She once wrote a piece that forced a congressman to resign, and her investigation into a trafficking network a few years back led to at least 3 companies shutting down, if I remember correctly." I turned toward him, not surprised that he knew the details of my work, but struck by how he said it, not with pride, not as a warning, but almost like an acknowledgement, as if he understood how dangerous I could be. Just as I was trying to understand the same about him, the main course arrived, roasted lamb and buttered vegetables. Sophie leaned in and whispered to me, "That was my mom's favorite." I froze. I had never heard Daniel speak of Sophie's mother. The girl continued, as though she had grown used to the silence around that absence. "She died when I was little. Dad doesn't talk about her much, but I look at her picture sometimes in his room." I said nothing. I didn't know what to ask. Daniel must have felt the weight in the air, because he shifted the mood with a question that caught me off guard. "If tomorrow you could write any story you wanted, no restrictions, no edits, no fear, what would it be?" I set my knife down and looked up at him. I'd write about a father who did terrible things to protect his child, and whether that made him a monster forever. Daniel didn't smile. He didn't flinch. He just looked at me, long and hard, then gave a slow nod. "If you told that story right," he said, "it might change the way people see justice." I couldn't tell if he meant it or if he was reciting a part he'd rehearsed long ago, but in that moment, something strange passed between us. Daniel wasn't trying to hide who he was. He wasn't pretending to be a good man. He was showing me the darkness, the danger, and the wound, and letting me step into the maze without offering a map. After dinner, Sophie hugged me goodnight. Daniel walked her to her room, then returned and stood near the fireplace, his posture quiet, his shoulders slightly bent. I stood there a moment before asking the question that had been sitting in my chest all evening. "Why let me near her?" His answer came without hesitation. "Because I need her to see a woman who isn't afraid of the truth, someone who asks questions, who doubts, who protects." I looked into the flames, said nothing more. In a mansion hidden deep in a forest of pines, I had just shared a meal with the daughter of a man the justice system once branded as a devil. But I didn't see a devil. I saw a child in need of tenderness, and a man trying to hold on to the last fragile thread of his humanity. That dinner wasn't like any I had ever known, and I understood. From that moment forward, nothing else ever would be. The next morning, I woke with a strange weight in my chest. It wasn't fear, and it wasn't peace either. It felt more like drifting so far from shore that the sound of the waves no longer reached you. I sat up and looked out the window. Snow was falling lightly, like powdered chalk settling over the back garden. But all I could see in my mind was Sophie, her eyes last night carrying something both innocent and far too knowing, and Daniel, the man whose name I still hadn't allowed myself to fully say in my thoughts, as if to speak it aloud would cause everything around me to shatter. Downstairs, the housekeeper handed me a new phone, saying Daniel wanted me to use it for now, just for communication. Only one number was saved in the contacts. I didn't ask. I turned it on, opened the browser, and typed in my own name. The first result was a brief headline from a small local outlet. Journalist Rachel Morgan, missing after Tuesday night shooting. Police declined to comment. I touched the screen. The photo was one taken 2 years ago, when I'd been invited to speak at a journalism conference. My eyes in that picture were confident and tired. I wondered if anyone was actually looking for me. Did Claire know what had happened? Had the newsroom gone silent? Or were they working behind the scenes to control the story? I left the estate just before noon in a car Daniel had arranged, a driver I didn't know. The destination was my old apartment on Santa Fe Drive, where I'd lived for the past 8 years, where I kept everything: drafts, notes, backups of investigations I hadn't yet encrypted. The car stopped 3 blocks from my building. Both ends of the street were cordoned off by police. The flames were out, but the air still held the bitter taste of smoke. I walked the rest of the way, my heart dragging like an anchor behind me. My 6th-floor apartment was now a hollow black frame, smoke rising from beams burned down to bone. A firefighter passed. I asked where the fire started. He said the living room. There were signs of an accelerant. It wasn't an accident. I stood there, surrounded by sirens and strangers, and understood something with sudden, irreversible clarity. I wasn't just being warned anymore. I had become a target. No more threats. This was action. Someone didn't want me silenced, they wanted me gone. Back in the car, my mind felt empty. Daniel called. His voice was calm as ever. I heard, he said. We need to talk. Tonight. I didn't answer. I just hung up and stared out the window. The houses slid past like shadows. Everything I had guarded and trusted, was now ash. I returned to the estate as the sky turned the color of faded steel. Sophie ran out to meet me, took my hand like we'd known each other for years. I didn't know whether to smile or cry. I sat on the couch, my hands still smelling faintly of smoke. Daniel came in and placed a cup of hot tea in front of me. How many people knew I lived there? I asked. He didn't pause. Too many. From old articles, your press credentials, school records, even your public talks. But there's one person I used to employ. He might be the leak. Mike Delgado, former Marine. Ran internal security for me. He's disappeared recently. I looked up. That name wasn't unfamiliar. I'd come across it before, tied to a case involving discharged soldiers and illegal arms deals. I asked Daniel if Mike could have sold information about me. He didn't answer immediately. Then he said, "He's in debt. Someone offered a high price for the list of people tied to my operations. That included you." I nodded, my lips tight. The pieces were beginning to fit. The shooting wasn't random. The girl standing in front of the restaurant wasn't a coincidence. I hadn't been pulled into this just because of instinct or timing. I'd gotten too close to the truth. And now I was a threat, to both sides. But what I hadn't expected was the feeling I had while standing in front of the burned remains of my home. It wasn't just grief. It was release. No apartment, no desk, no safe place to retreat to. There was nothing to fall back on anymore, which meant I had no choice but to move forward and face whatever came next. That night, I sat alone in the temporary study on the 2nd floor of the estate, the pale blue glow of the computer screen washing over my face like moonlight filtered through fog. Outside the window, the pine forest lay silent beneath the snow, so still that even the sound of a single branch snapping would have set my heart racing. The fire in the hearth had long since died, but I couldn't pull myself away from the desk. After the fire at my apartment, I knew without a doubt that I was being watched, that every document still in my possession was now worth more than ever. I reopened the blackline folder Daniel had given me, this time digging deeper into files I had initially dismissed as unimportant. Hidden near the bottom was a folder labeled Athena. Its contents were encrypted in binary, locked behind a password. But Daniel had left a quiet breadcrumb, a small note buried in an old Excel sheet, an allusion to a passcode formed from Sophie's birth date combined with the date of his wife's death. I did the math. February of 2015 and November 2018. Converted everything to text, typed it in. The screen went black. Then a stream of new files appeared. They weren't financial reports, not satellite images, not internal memos. These were messages, email threads between anonymous parties, signed only by letters B, C, F. The subject lines repeated the same words again and again: transport, protection, elimination. I was scrolling through, trying to make sense of it, when one exchange froze me in place. A message between B and C. The child has been confirmed. The mother still doesn't know she took the original file by mistake. Then the final line. Do it at Santa Fe Drive. The fire will erase everything. My heart thundered so hard I couldn't hear anything else. Santa Fe Drive, my address. And the mother there was no one else that could mean but me. I reread the message, word by word, sentence by sentence. Someone knew I had touched the core of this story. Not just the money laundering, not just the smuggling, but something tied directly to Sophie. I kept searching, clicking through email after email, until I found a thread between C and another figure signed G. Attached was an ultrasound image. Hospital records from a private clinic on the outskirts of Boston. The mother's name was blurred, but behind it, in the corner of a passport copy, I saw it. Rachel Morgan. My face went cold. I had never been pregnant in Boston. I had never been to that clinic, but that file had my name, my birthday, my identity. Someone had used my past, my name, to build a false identity, and the child in that record was Sophie. I couldn't feel my body anymore, just the pulse of something breaking apart. I stood up, left the room, and walked down the stairs without thinking. Daniel was in the living room, alone, seated by the fire, which had just been lit again. He looked up at me with a calmness that unsettled me more than panic ever could. I tossed the printed documents onto the table between us. You knew, I said. He was silent for a moment, then nodded. So I wasn't just a bystander, I pressed. I was part of this. From the beginning. Daniel stood slowly, walking toward me. The firelight flickered across his face, softening every edge, blurring every truth. I didn't choose you, he said, but I knew. I knew from the moment you submitted that first article on Callahan. I thought either you'll get yourself killed, or you'll expose them. I chose to believe in the second. I stepped back. Is Sophie, my daughter? He looked at me, shook his head. No, but there's a reason they want you to believe she is. I didn't understand. None of it made sense anymore. But what was clear, painfully, terrifyingly clear, was that I hadn't just stumbled into this story. I had been placed inside it, positioned like a piece on a board. And when I touched Sophie, when I pulled her from the street and held her between myself and Gunfire, I became something more than a witness. I became necessary. My voice was barely audible. Who's behind all of this? Daniel's eyes darkened. Someone who used to be my friend, he said. Now he's the most dangerous enemy I've ever known. And he doesn't want you to see the truth. Because if you see it, he loses everything. And I understood. What I had uncovered wasn't just a trace of crime. It was the door to its center. And I had opened it. There was no going back. Not anymore. I didn't sleep for hours after that conversation with Daniel. My mind churned in restless loops, caught between scattered fragments of truth, as if someone had reached inside, ripped apart everything I thought I knew, and left me to piece it back together only now. None of it fit the way it used to. I paced the room, each step marking the rhythm of something dark swelling in my chest. Inside me was a storm pulling in two directions. One side burned with anger at being deceived, manipulated like a pawn. The other was something quieter, deeper, a strange ache that came every time I thought of Sophie, her eyes when she looked at me with a trust I hadn't earned but couldn't shake. I knew then I had to go further, not for Daniel, not even for the story, but because I had already gone too far to turn back. I opened the Athena folder again, the one buried deepest inside the laptop's encrypted architecture. This time I followed a series of short emails that didn't seem to tie directly to the trafficking or laundering operations. But one line stopped me cold. The sender was simply marked as G, and the message read, "She still doesn't remember me." I frowned. That same line repeated 3 times, in 3 different emails, months apart. G didn't just know who I was. G was waiting for me to remember him. I launched a trace on the email origins, tracking the IPs through a maze of layered proxies. Most were dead ends. But just one had a leak, a weak link in the chain that gave me a location. It came from an old building on the east side of the city, a place I had been before. It was near the warehouse that burned down 3 years ago, the one I suspected was involved in human transport. I didn't wait. I threw on my coat, grabbed the keys Daniel had left for me, and drove into the city in the half-light before dawn. Snow had stopped falling, but the roads were slick with ice. The building was a decaying apartment complex, long abandoned, sagging toward collapse. It looked like it had been waiting to be forgotten. I climbed to the 3rd floor, careful with each creaking step. That was where the last signal had originated, Unit 34. The door was unlocked. I pushed it open slowly. The scent of mildew and soot hit me all at once. The apartment was nearly empty. Dust-covered curtains, a broken chair, and on the floor at the very center of the room was something that stopped my breath. a half-burned picture frame. Inside, a photograph of me, taken years ago. I was sitting at an outdoor cafe, smiling gently at the camera. It wasn't a photo I had ever shared. It had never been published. There was only one copy, and it had been stored on a private drive in my apartment, the apartment that had just burned. Someone had been there, before the fire. Someone had taken this, and brought it here. I turned to leave. Then I heard it, footsteps, quiet, deliberate, rising from the floor below. I pressed myself to the wall, reached for my phone, switched on the camera in silent mode. The steps stopped just outside the door. A figure appeared, tall, thin, wearing a dark coat, a hood pulled low over the face. The figure didn't step inside, just stood there, watching. Then a voice. Low, hoarse, barely more than a whisper. I watched you grow up. I watched you write every line. I watched you try to burn your past. I didn't understand. But that voice sent ice through my spine. Who are you? I asked. No answer, just a faint laugh. Then the figure turned and walked away. I ran after him, down the hall, to the stairwell. But by the time I reached the landing, he was gone. No footsteps, no echo, only the sound of snow falling again through the shattered window. I left the building with frozen hands and a heart hammering out of rhythm. By the time I returned to the estate, the sky had turned the color of cold steel. Daniel was already waiting in the hallway. He didn't ask where I'd been. He just said, "G showed up, didn't he?" I nodded. He placed a hand on my shoulder, firm but careful. "He's been watching you for years. He stood and watched your apartment burn, and he did nothing." I felt something inside me recoil. "He doesn't want you dead quickly," Daniel said quietly. "He wants you afraid." And now I understood. This had never just been a conspiracy. It was personal. It was history. It was a man who had been watching me from the shadows for years, waiting for the moment I stepped willingly into the fire. And he had been there, watching me burn, without blinking. 3 days after coming face to face with the ghost who had been watching me for years, Daniel decided it was time to tell me about Operation Switchblade. The name sounded like some old military code name, the kind you'd find buried in a dusty file cabinet beneath layers of redacted history. But it wasn't. It was real. A carefully constructed mission, planned long before I ever stepped into this world, with one singular purpose: to dismantle the underground network propping up the Callahan Empire. And not just the public figures. Operation Switchblade was meant to bring down the ones who had never appeared in any file, never made it into any headline. Daniel didn't pretend he was on the outside. He told me plainly he had helped build it. In the beginning, he had been the architect. But like every story that touches power and trust, things had slipped, warped, turned. We sat facing each other in a small office tucked beside the library. On the wall behind him was a map of the city, peppered with red dots connected by strands of string so thin they looked like spider silk. At the center of the web was a face. No name, but I recognized it instantly. It was G, the man who had watched me, the man behind the fire, the man Daniel once called a friend. His real name was Garrett Vaughn. He had once been military intelligence. After discharge, he became a private security consultant for powerful corporations. But what made him dangerous wasn't just his knowledge, it was how effortlessly he could disappear behind the mask of legitimacy. He had served as Reyes Logistics' internal security head, trusted by Daniel to patch the cracks, vet employees, manage sensitive extractions when needed. Until Daniel discovered Garrett wasn't just tracking enemies, he was building a file on Daniel himself. Medical records, financial accounts, personal connections, even Sophie's file. Nothing was off limits. Garrett hadn't simply betrayed him. He had constructed his own network in secret, peeling away pieces of Daniel's infrastructure, then using it to make side deals with Callahan. People, weapons, cash slipping through customs, sealed in containers no one ever opened. Operation Switchblade had originally been Daniel's plan to burn the bridge behind him, to leave the old empire and begin again, by feeding the federal government the very evidence they needed to act. But Garrett was already ahead. He turned the game inside out, framed Daniel as the one orchestrating the crimes, pulled back into the shadows where no one could find him. And me? I had been part of his script from the beginning. Garrett knew I was investigating Callahan. He had traced my steps. He had led me to Jordan's Steakhouse that night. Sophie may have been a target, or a lure, maybe both. Either way, Garrett knew I would show up, knew I would interfere, knew I would become entangled too deep to escape. I asked Daniel, "What now?" He was quiet for a long moment. Then he opened a drawer and pulled out a small, cold piece of hardware, an encrypted hard drive. "This is the final copy of Operation Switchblade," he said. It holds every real name tied to the network. Financial transfers, locations, even recordings Garrett's voice, speaking directly to Callahan. He looked at me and added, "I keep the original, but if I die, you need to release this. All of it." I didn't speak right away. The weight of what he'd handed me settled in my hands like something alive. I met his eyes. "And Sophie?" His gaze shifted. Worry surfaced quiet, but unmistakable. "Garrett has hinted," he said, voice low, "that he'd hurt her. To push me over the edge. He knows she's my weakness. And now, he knows you're my second." I nodded, slowly, as the cold clawed through my spine. I had never imagined I would find myself caught in a war between two former soldiers, two men once on the same side. But now I knew. Garrett didn't just want to stop the truth. He wanted to control the story. If I exposed him, he'd paint me as unstable. If I stayed silent, he'd win. There was no middle ground. Operation Switchblade was no longer a hidden mission. It was a blade drawn and glinting, poised on the edge between life and death, between justice and a truth twisted until it broke, and I was the one holding the hilt. I clipped the hidden camera to my chest in the late afternoon, just as snow began to fall again, fine and weightless like ash settling over the edges of the city. Daniel had been gone since morning, tracking one of Garrett's former drivers who had attempted to withdraw cash from a gas station nearly 100 miles away. I stayed behind with Sophie and the housekeeper, but there was no quiet left in me. The recording from the encrypted Operation Switchblade drive echoed in my mind, a whisper laced with threat. In it, Garrett made one thing unmistakably clear. If Rachel Morgan kept digging, she would disappear before she could ever open her mouth. It wasn't a metaphor. At dusk, I left the estate in a private rental car. The GPS deliberately exposed a silent invitation sent straight to Garrett. My destination was a forgotten container yard near the Southern Industrial District, once used as a transit hub according to the Switchblade files. I had sent one message to the last still-active number in G's encrypted email thread. No explanation, just one line. "I remember. Meet me." I didn't know if he'd come, but if he did, I would record him. And if I was lucky, I'd survive to release it all. I arrived just as the last light drained from the sky. The wind slid through the gaps in the old metal like the breath of something long asleep and stirred awake. I stepped out of the car, gripping my phone tightly, my eyes scanning the dark. Nothing moved. I walked deeper into the yard, toward a rusted container tipped to one side. Its door cracked open from the inside. He stepped out slowly. Tall, dark coat, hood drawn low. I didn't need to see his face. I knew it was him. Garrett Vaughn. He stopped a few feet away. No rush, no words. Just raised a black Glock and leveled it at me like it was the start of a conversation. I didn't move. Fear slid down my spine like a blade of ice. He smiled, calm, almost gentle. "You weren't supposed to remember," he said, his voice a quiet dread. "You could have lived out your life as a mediocre reporter, raised that girl as if she were your own. But you chose the truth, and truth," he paused, "is always the most expensive thing." I didn't speak, didn't argue, didn't beg. I just stared at him, waiting for the flicker behind his eyes. A moment of doubt, a crack. He took a step closer. The gun still up. I saw the faint red gleam of a recording light on his chest. A camera. He was filming too, but not to expose anything. To control the final image. My death. I shifted slightly, just enough to catch the light on his face. The camera on my chest captured everything. His voice, his eyes, the steel in his hand. Then I said it. "If you shoot, this ends, and you know I'm not bluffing." Garrett let out a soft laugh. "I have copies. I have people inside your newsroom. You won't win." "Maybe," I said, "but I have Sophie." He froze. Just a flicker. But I saw it. He blinked. "Once. If you kill me," I went on, my voice steady, "that girl will never be out of my reach. The files have already been sent. Daniel knows everything, and all you have left is that gun." His hand tightened on the trigger but didn't fire. He stepped back. A moment of silence. Then, headlights exploded behind him, blinding, cutting the dark in half. Daniel's voice came from the shadows, calm and low. "Put it down, Garrett." Garrett turned, swinging his weapon toward the light. But before he could shoot, the crack of a silenced gun tore the stillness open. Garrett staggered, fell. Not Daniel. It was the housekeeper. He stepped out from behind a container, the pistol still warm in his hand. I dropped to my knees, the shock crashing over me like a wave. Daniel rushed to me, caught me before I fell further. Garrett lay motionless, the snow beneath him blooming red. His camera still blinked, still recording. I didn't know if I was alive because of timing or something stranger, but I knew this moment was the split in the road. This story would never live on paper again. It had been written in blood, in data, in the final stare of a man who once believed he could not lose, and I, just a woman with a gun pointed at her heart, had turned the camera on my chest into the only weapon that mattered, the one that could change everything. The next morning, I sat in the wooden study of the old estate, staring at the final decrypted files from Daniel's hard drive. Garrett was dead, but his presence lingered like a virus, woven deep into every hidden thread of Callahan's network. And if I didn't act now, everything we had uncovered would sink back into the dark, like a body dragged to the bottom of a lake and pinned there with stone. Daniel entered without a word, placing a cup of coffee beside me, along with a folder stamped in red. Inside were copies of forged contracts, falsified financial reports, and recordings of calls between Garrett and senior board members of Callahan's conglomerate. But one file rose above the rest. It was a surveillance video pulled from Garrett's own security system, a closed-door meeting, soundproofed. Just two men, Garrett Vaughn and Richard Callahan. Callahan's voice came through the speakers, unmistakable, cold, controlled, cutting. "We don't need to know who she is. If she writes the story, we'll buy the damn paper, and if she doesn't back off, she'll just be a body no one remembers." I sent that video to 3 secure email addresses I had prepared days ago. One to Claire, my former editor, one to a seasoned investigative reporter in New York, the mentor who taught me how to chase truth when no one wanted it found. And the last one, I sent to myself, to remember that this time, I wasn't allowed to fail. At exactly 7 p.m., the video dropped simultaneously on 3 major news outlets. The documents were excerpted and sourced. The audio and images, undeniable. The names that once only existed as rumors became headlines, no longer speculation, no longer questions. Richard Callahan, Garrett Vaughn, Reyes Logistics, the shell companies, the false charities, the disappearances that had never been investigated, all of it spread across the public record like spilled ink on white linen. The reaction was faster than I had expected. Within an hour, hashtags linked to Callahan, Operation Switchblade, and Garrett's death were trending nationally. Within 24 hours, the federal investigation was reopened. FBI agents raided 3 of Callahan's regional offices, Denver, Chicago, and Miami. Bank accounts were frozen. Stockholders began dumping shares in panic. The board convened an emergency session. No one claimed responsibility. Callahan was subpoenaed. He didn't appear. Instead, he was photographed at a golf course, hunched and cornered, cameras surrounding him like wolves. As for Daniel, he vanished from the narrative entirely. No press statements, no appearances. He left me the choice. Tell the rest of the story or let it end here. I chose to tell it. For 3 days, I wrote without pause. I didn't sleep, didn't speak. Only stopped when Sophie silently placed a glass of milk beside me, then slipped away. I wrote it all. Every truth, every piece of data, every memory carved in smoke and blood. I told the full story of Operation Switchblade, of Daniel's quiet rebellion from within, of Garrett's betrayal, of the fall of men who believed they were untouchable. I wrote about the child standing in the crossfire, unaware if she was bait or proof of something more innocent, something purer than the adults around her had long forgotten how to believe in. When the story was published, it wasn't just a report. It was testimony, an indictment, a blade that cut through the last remaining veil of an empire too long cloaked in shadow. Claire sent me a message. "You did what no one else would. Don't let them pull you into another kind of power." I knew what she meant, but this time, I had stepped into the light, and I wasn't afraid anymore. In the end, the Callahan empire didn't fall to a bullet. It fell to a video, to a data file, to a woman who once stood between a gun and a child and refused to turn back. Truth always needs someone to speak it, and this time, I was that someone. 48 hours after the article went live, I received the first message. There were no words, just a single photo. Sophie, playing in the yard of the estate. In the distance, barely visible, was my silhouette standing on the front porch. No sound echoed in my head, just a spreading hollowness in my chest, as if someone had suddenly clamped down on the last breath in my lungs. The second message arrived less than 5 minutes later. "If you write one more word, she'll never turn 13. No signature, no location. But I recognized the voice behind those words. The cold, methodical cadence. The precision of every syllable like a blade carving straight into the mind. Garrett might have been dead, but his shadow was still alive. Somewhere in the Callahan network, Someone still loyal or worse, someone with too much to lose was ready to act. I called Daniel immediately. He answered after a long ring, his voice low, tight, as though he'd already been waiting for this moment. "You have to leave the estate," he said. "Now." He told me Sophie would be moved to a secure location with the housekeeper. And me? He said I needed to disappear, for at least a few days. I didn't agree right away. I'd faced guns, fire, long nights swallowed by fear and doubt. But this was different. Not because I was afraid to die, but because, for the first time, it wasn't just my life being threatened. It was a child's, a life untouched by the game of truth and power. A soul too young to know she'd been placed at the fault line between what we expose and what others will kill to protect. That night, I stayed in a small room Daniel had prepared in a suburb outside the city. The walls were plain. The air smelled of old fabric and dust. On the desk before me, my laptop glowed in the dark. Reader responses filled the screen. Some called me brave. Others, reckless. Some warned me that this article wouldn't just bring down Callahan. It would awaken forces I hadn't yet named. I read every comment. Not for validation, but for signs, clues, anything that might reveal the sender of the message. But they were just voices scattered across the digital tide. I reopened my draft. The last paragraph. I had written it in the estate study while Sophie laughed somewhere outside, and Daniel stood silently at the map, tracking the final pieces of a dismantled empire. That final line was a question. Is truth ever enough to protect someone? Or is it just another name for something bigger, darker, something that can erase memory if needed? I still don't know the answer, but I know this. I can't stay silent. I can't let truth become something you bury in a safe, sealed with a threat. So I wrote another piece. Not an exposé, a confession. I told them about the night in the container. The gun pressed to my forehead, the camera strapped to my chest. I wrote about Sophie, about the way she looked at me. Not with fear, but with something gentler, stronger. A trust I still don't have words for. I wrote about Garrett, about Daniel, about choices none of us ever really wanted. I titled the piece, My Truth, Their Threat. And when I hit publish, I accepted the cost. But I didn't stop there. I added a link, a door, to everything else. The full archive, unencrypted, unredacted, no passwords, no locks. I knew what it meant. They could kill me. They could keep sending messages, try to scare me, try to hurt the people I love. But now I wasn't the only one who knew this story. And when enough people know, no one can be silenced forever. I closed the laptop just as dawn broke. Outside the window, pale sunlight threaded through the thin curtains. A new day had begun. But this time, I wasn't just surviving. I was carrying the truth. No matter how terrifying it might be. I got the call from Claire on a March morning when the snow had mostly melted from the rooftops, and the sunlight had grown just warm enough for people to step outside without heavy coats. Her voice over the phone carried a tremble she didn't try to hide. "You've been nominated for a Pulitzer." I stayed quiet for a long time. Not because I was shocked, but because I wasn't sure it still mattered. The story I told, the truths I unearthed, the threats I received, and the weight of watching Sophie clutch a stuffed bear before bed in a house that may or may not have been safe. None of it felt like it belonged in a frame or on a podium. Awards were a distant echo at the end of a battle where there were no clean victories, only survival. Still, I nodded and said thank you. Claire paused, then added, "If you win, you'll have to speak. Are you ready for that?" I looked out the window. Across the street, a child rode her bicycle down the sidewalk, her hair flying in the wind, her laughter trailing behind her like a ribbon in the breeze. It was a reminder that the world keeps turning, no matter what we've endured. I said, "I'll think about it." Public reaction to the article remained sharply divided. Some praised it as a turning point in investigative journalism. Others questioned the motives of those involved, especially Daniel. Meanwhile, the legal system began to move, slowly, but steadily. Richard Callahan was arrested at a private airport as he attempted to board a flight to South America under a false identity. The photo of him, hair disheveled, face sunken, made the front pages of nearly every major paper. At the first press conference, the federal prosecutor confirmed dozens of indictments tied to money laundering, human trafficking, bribery, and obstruction of justice. Garrett Vaughn, though deceased, was named as a central figure in the case. The data from Operation Switchblade was deemed core, irrefutable evidence. Daniel never appeared publicly. He chose to testify anonymously, submitting his statements through secure channels. In return, he was granted full protection for Sophie and allowed to keep custody. We didn't talk much after that, not because something was broken. but because there was a quiet understanding between us now that sometimes the greatest thing two people can give each other is space to move forward on their own terms. I went to the courthouse the morning the first official hearing began. I didn't sit in the courtroom. I stood behind the tinted glass on the second-floor corridor. I saw Richard Callahan as they brought him in, hands cuffed, suit rumpled. He held his head high and scanned the room, his eyes moving across the faces but never settling. When his gaze passed over where I stood, I wondered if he recognized me, the woman who had pulled apart the empire he spent nearly 3 decades building. Probably not. Maybe I was just another name in the long list of enemies he'd long since dismissed. But for me, that moment was closure. Not because he was arrested, but because, for the first time, I wasn't afraid anymore. The Pulitzer came a few weeks later. I didn't attend the ceremony. Claire accepted on my behalf. The speech was recorded and played on stage under lights and applause. In the recording, I said the most important thing I'd learned wasn't how to trace a criminal empire or how to outlast fear. It was how to hold on to decency in a world with so little room left for it, and that if a child could look at you through smoke and bullets and still believe in your goodness, then you didn't get to turn away, not even once. When it all quieted down, I returned to a quieter life. No more cross-state investigations. No more nights with my face lit only by the glow of spreadsheets and encrypted files. But I still wrote, about smaller things, about courage, about ordinary people who changed something, anything, just by refusing to stay silent. And sometimes, on spring afternoons, Sophie would sit beside me on the porch with a box of colored pencils, drawing scenes she imagined from the story I had told. Sometimes it was fire, sometimes a camera, but mostly it was a woman standing in front of a child, empty hands, but unwavering. And I knew, if there was anything I had truly won in the end, it was that trust. Not from the world. From her. As time passed, the old estate slowly became something else entirely. It was no longer a safe house in the shadows of hidden wars, no longer a fortress against the chaos of power plays, lies, and survival. It became a home. A real one. A place where two people, once strangers, once caught in the eye of a storm neither asked for, found a quiet they hadn't known they needed. Sophie grew up day by day. Her eyes were still the same, clear, wide, but now they held a different kind of light. No longer the look of a child frozen in the sound of gunfire. Now, it was the gaze of a girl who knew, with absolute certainty, that she was loved, protected, and no longer a pawn in anyone's game. I still wrote, but not to expose an empire or dismantle the machinery of corruption. I wrote to remember, to remind myself and anyone still willing to listen, that truth, courage, and love are the 3 things we must never trade away. In the end, I came to understand that family doesn't always begin with blood. Sometimes, it begins in a single moment when you reach out and shield a child who isn't yours. Sometimes, it grows from the kind of people who were once nothing more than strangers, but who chose to stand beside each other through the darkest hour. Family is a fortress. It's the one place where you can lay down your armor, release your fears, and know without doubt that you will be welcomed anyway. Though my story finds its quiet close here, the lessons remain. That within each of us lives a kind of courage, waiting only for the right reason to rise. That no one is too small to make a difference, and that sometimes all it takes is one person believing in you, and suddenly, the impossible becomes something you survive. If you've listened this far, thank you. Thank you for walking this road with me, for holding this long story in your hands and heart. If you'd like to keep sharing in stories like this one's filled with feeling, with humanity, with hope, please subscribe, like, and share the YouTube channel Dear Single Mom. I hope we'll meet again, in stories that remind us what matters most. And you, how did this story touch you? Did it stir something in your own life? Have you ever been that woman who stood in the storm to protect someone else? Or maybe, just maybe, you've been waiting for someone to reach out and take your hand through the darkest days. If you feel like sharing, leave a comment below. I would truly love to hear from your heart. Thank you. And until we meet again, I wish you health, peace, and joy in every day that follows. Goodbye for now and take care.